All right, welcome back. This is part two of the presentation of chapter 6. So let's get to it. Chapter 6, Risk Evaluation, Tools Used to Evaluate Risk for Safety Professionals. Risk Management Tool number 7, Risk Indices. Indices, of course, is the plural of index. A purpose, a risk index refers to the combined likelihood and severity of a hazardous event or consequence anticipated from an identified hazard. Where we heard that before. So we're talking about your basic 5x5 or whatever you want to use, risk index. A risk index is used to rank and compare risks as part of the risk evaluation. Its main purpose is to help distinguish those risks which are unacceptable to the organization and provide a ranking of risks by risk level to prioritize treatment. Risk indices are developed to summarize the risk of an event or condition by using numbers or categorical values for the purpose of identifying and comparing risks. Indices can be qualitative using word descriptors, letters and colors, or semi-quantitative featuring numerical rankings or measures to describe and communicate the level of stakeholders and decision makers. Often included in a risk scorecard and formulas, risk indices can be used to calculate index values and further evaluate risk. They are often specific to a particular type of risk and used to compare different situations where that risk occurs. The different types of risks, by the way, might be risk to people, risk to the environment, risk to property, risk to your business. So while numbers are used, this is simply to allow for manipulation. In cases where the underlying model or system is not well known or not able to be represented, it is usually better to use a more overtly qualitative approach, which does not apply a level of accuracy which is impossible using ordinal scales. Process. The risk measures that drive or influence the risk are selected from the index. Selected to form the index. To form an index, an understanding of the risk sources and how consequences can occur is required. In other words, the risk measures, how the risk is measured, must be identified. A risk measure is a numerical summary of risk, while a risk index is often composed of numbers, letters, words, or colors to better communicate risk to the user. A risk measure is considered a subset of risk indices. One such example is the OSHA Heat Index. It uses an index system developed by the U.S. National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, commonly called NOAA, that combines both air temperature and relative humidity into a single value that indicates the apparent temperature in degrees Fahrenheit, or how hot the weather will feel. Now, this is a very useful tool, and it's used, and you should have it handy if you live anywhere where you're going to get this kind of temperatures, which are pretty low. So this is something you probably should have handy because you will be referring to it from time to time. And there are some other indexes in the book, and I'm not going to read each one of them that are available out there. So on risk indices here, when selecting or developing a risk index, the following steps should be considered. Define the top event, or what's the main thing we're talking about here. Select the risk factors, develop risk measures, and develop a risk index. Pretty simple. Steps in developing a risk index, we're going to talk about each one of these now. Define the top event. The risk assessment team must first select a hazardous scenario or top event for the assessment. This should include a description of the hazards and their causes, control measures already in place, and the resulting consequences. Select risk factors. Based on the established context, stakeholders must understand and describe the risk of an event or hazard. Factors that influence the magnitude of risk are identified and described with assigned scores and combined using a risk formula equation to represent the relative relationship between risks. Develop risk measure. Depending on the context and the selected risk factors, a formula or scale for measuring risk is selected or developed. The risk measurement system should be tested and validated by using different scoring systems or scales to ensure that it is accurate and consistent. Develop the risk index. The risk measure system is translated into an index, such as categorical scales, color-coded scales, or alphanumeric scales to improve communication and understanding of risk to stakeholders and decision makers. So you can see there's a lot of stuff. I think that's the last one on the risk indexes here. Whoops. I do. Oh, I popped out of this thing. Okay, let me get back to it. So you can see on this, go back to this risk indices, excuse me. there's a lot of different types you can develop, and I don't know. I kind of prefer the KISS method, keep it simple, stupid, and that's why I kind of like the 5x5. I've used the 4x4, and that's okay too. But 5x5 seems to me to be about the right number. You can go crazy on this thing, but I think you can keep it simple. But basically, well, the next tool is risk heat maps. A risk heat map is a table or matrix that uses colors representing risk levels. Its primary purpose is to visually communicate risk rankings to decision makers and their evaluation and treatment of risk. Risk heat maps are generated from risk indices and risk analyses, such as what-if analyses, FMEAs, and process hazard analyses. They are used by decision makers and stakeholders in the evaluation, prioritization, and treatment of risks. Individual risks are plotted on the heat map grid according to the colors corresponding to the level of the risk. The heat map is typically constructed as a two-dimensional matrix with an axis measuring severity of risk and an axis measuring the frequency or likelihood of occurrence. There you go. Again, all right. You got the severity and likelihood. Now they're going to sometimes, like I said, these people like to throw in different names for the same thing: frequency, probability, likelihood, all the same thing. Usually probability is defined more like a numeral, like numbers, but anyhow, that within this particular on risk indices, frequency, probability, or likelihood are the same thing. They're just people trying to use different numbers to confuse you. The number of levels for each axis can range from a simple 2x2 or 3x3 model to a more granular model. The established risk criteria and risk level definitions developed by the organization are used to characterize the heat map risk levels. Process. The risk scores produced from the risk analysis tool, such as the risk ID presented in figure 612, next slide, are plotted on the risk heat map, and then a slide after next for visual comparison. So here's some of the things they come up with: the likelihoods and severities for these three hazards. And I'm not going to go into the detail of it. You can see it here. And they're going to pop them onto this risk heat map. Heat map seems to work pretty good for that NOAA heat, which was really the heat index. But for everything else, it's just basically not much different from a risk index. I don't know why we just, but it doesn't give you numbers like a risk index does, where you can prioritize them, but it kind of gives you the heat. But I can see where it could be a little bit confusing too. I personally don't care for it too much, but it's one of the things that's out there. ALARP. ALARP is the concept of achieving a risk level as low as reasonably practicable. It is defined by ANSI Z590.3 as that level of risk which can be further lowered only by an increase in resource expenditure that is disproportionate in relation to the resulting decrease in risk. The concept of ALARP was originally developed in the United Kingdom's Health and Safety at Work 1974 Act and further developed by the UK Health and Safety Executive. Now, this is a formalized procedure, but in reality, it's kind of something you're going through like as a matter of course and semi-automatically in your thought process when you're trying to reduce risk. You're going to try to get it. I mean, if you can come up with something that another control that you can put in place that will give you some significant risk, lowered risk, you're going to do it without going through this. You're just going to do it, right? I mean, so this is something that's I don't know. It's the concept of as low as reasonably practicable is always there in other forms. In other words, you could say, well, we could do this, but it's going to cost $10 million. Well, obviously, you're probably not going to do that. So there you go. I mean, it's the same concept. But the ALARP model illustrated in figure 6.2, next slide, is used to classify risks as belonging to specific categories ranging from 4 unacceptable risks where further risk assessment and risk reduction are required before operations can continue. ALARP risk, which is given highest priority for risk reduction. ALARP risk, which further risk reduction is taken at appropriate time, and very low risk is broadly acceptable and risk reduction discretionary. But again, you can see these 4 aren't significantly different from your basic regular risk matrix, which whether you use 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or 25 down to the 5. And this is the kind of unacceptable risk that the 4 categories are using. And unacceptable risk, immediate action required, operation not permissible, except in rare and extraordinary circumstances. And I guarantee you that if the risk is high in an operation, that it's going to shut down the facility or shut down production significantly. Those are going to be considered extraordinary circumstances, and you're going to have to do something about it. But and so in the real world. So now the second area is ALARP steps must be taken to reduce risk as low as reasonably practicable. Now, why they put this in two different categories, but they do. 3, remedial actions to be given high priority, and remedial actions to be taken at appropriate time. So do it right away or appropriate time, which means whenever you get to it, I guess. Very low risk remedial actions, discretionary procedures are to be in place to ensure risk level is maintained. So that's your ALARP. The ALARP concept is used to assist organizational decision making in order to judge whether the risk level of risk is acceptable, as low as reasonably practicable, or unacceptable. It is applied within the context of the organization's culture and workplace environment, as well as industry norms, regulatory requirements, and community setting. And this is the risk occurrence and severity using the ALARP concept. And I'm not going to read all this little detail in here, but you can see it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 by 4 matrix kind of, and comes up with numbers at the bottom. So again, this is basically a risk matrix right here, what you're defining. ALARP acceptable risk, they're calling first aid or non-treatment incidents costing less than $1,000, I guess it's supposed to be. ALARP risk, medical treatment, restricted work, and recordable incidents costing more than $1,000 that may occur if conditions exist. Action is required at the appropriate time. So that's the step 2, and start from the bottom up. ALARP 3, step 3, high priority risk. Risk is in result in disabling injury or illness, permanent impairment, and incidents resulting in more than $50,000 that are likely to occur if conditions exist. Action is required as soon as possible. And 4, unacceptable risk, result in 1 or more fatalities, multiple serious hospitalizations, and costing more than $250,000 that are almost certain to occur. Operation must immediately cease and risk level reduced before operations can continue. So that's it. Now, one of the things that's what I mentioned, when they throw the dollar figure in here, that's probably a pretty good idea, because that would not only come with the injury, which is a safety professional, that's your main goal, is to prevent injuries to people. But you also, of course, want to prevent environmental damage. You want to prevent damage to your business, of course, too. So by throwing those numbers in there, while there might not be there might conceivably be an area where the risk isn't to the people, but to the property or to the company, business, or to the environment or something like that. So that's where those numbers could come in. So that's probably a pretty good idea to have them in there. So that's chapter 6, risk evaluation. And and this is me. Welcome to my world here. And we're going to end this whole talk here right now. And you know what I want you to do in the meantime, and that is be safe.